Welcome back to Face the Nation. Joining us for some more 2020 analysis are Jamal Simmons, Democratic strategist and host on Hill TV, Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report, and of course, our own Ed O'Keefe. Ed, you just laid out the crowded field. I was speaking to a Democratic strategist this week, or fundraiser, I should say, who said this is like waiting for Godot.
When we're waiting for Biden?
When we're waiting for Biden.
Absolutely.
And still not sure. Godot never shows up.
Right.
Is Biden going to show up?
I mean, if you believe the verbal slip-up last night at the Dover Downs, yes, he certainly made it seem like he is. You know, I asked him earlier this week when he was at this firefighters union event here in D.C. along a rope line, what's the holdup? He says there's no holdup. He just looks at history, which suggests that people have waited a little longer than this current crop that got in, you know, at the stroke of midnight, essentially, as the year began, and thinks that he has some time to spend because he's got the name,
right.
Clearly has some money ready and ready to come, has locked up some staff. We don't know to what extent the size of his operation will be, but all signs still point to early April, sometime before tax day, April 15th.
You know, Ed mentions history, and with the vice president, history is actually a pretty tough marker for him.
What do you mean?
Democrats, you know, he is very popular. People all over the country are hungering for him to get into the race. But Democrats have never elected a sitting or former vice president to the White House before. Democrats also, if you go back and look at some of the 538 polling, the person who was ahead in the national polls at this period, a year out from Election Day, did not ultimately win the White House. And there's only 3 times that person won the nomination. It was Walter Mondale in 1984, Al Gore in 2000, and Hillary Clinton in 2016. Hillary is a tough marker. So the vice president really has to, I think, take on the fact that he's going up against these trends, and that means he has to do things differently. He needs a more diverse staff than he has had in the past. He's got to be willing to talk about progressive issues in a way that's more compelling than he has in the past, and I hope that's what they're planning.
Amy, do we need new blood, as former President Obama suggested? I mean, he's not necessarily going to.
He's not the newest person in the mix for his years there on the Senate side. It's really interesting watching Democrats grappling with their choices this time. They have all kinds of opportunities here, generationally, on race, and on
gender.
And on gender. And it seems that the issue really comes down to this. How safe of a choice do Democrats want to make? And by safe, we all are going to determine that. The Democrats are going to determine that too in very different ways. And the safe being really who's the one who we know can beat Donald Trump. That's the question a lot of Democrats are asking themselves. What does that mean? And versus who's the most disruptive in this field. Waiting for Godot is a good description. I also think primaries are a lot like trying to figure out who you're going to marry. And do you go with the person who really races your heart, or do you go with the person you want to bring home to your parents, right? And Democrats...
And you don't think the two things can be the same thing?
Sometimes they can be both. I think Barack Obama was both. I think in 2004, remember there was that infamous bumper sticker that said, dated Dean, married Kerry, right? Dean was a lot of fun. And that's what and if you're a Democrat, a lot of Democrats will say, exactly, when we made the safe choice, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, we lost. We got to go with somebody who's going to be engaging in a very different way. Just one more quick thing about engaging and broadening, going away from safe. It's also about broadening the electoral map outside of the presidential race, which is the Senate. There are a bunch of Democrats I talk to who say, we could win the White House, but if we don't win the Senate, then guess what? Not a lot of this is going to matter. We got to go into places like Texas, Iowa, North Carolina, Georgia. Those are the races that are going to determine control of the Senate.
Arizona.
It was such a rollout for Beto O'Rourke.
Right.
I mean, people are acting like he is anointed. Is this going to backfire on him?
Well, and I think to the charge that the media may have overdone it, we have to remember something. I made this point repeatedly in our reporting this past week. You talk to every other campaign that's involved in this right now, the one name that kept coming up in private conversations was always him. Is he going to do it? Do you think he can raise $80 million again? So this was them essentially goading us into saying, you know, they're scared of him, very scared of him. And this coffee shop countertop campaign that he launched this week by jumping up on countertops repeatedly, Was it you that said, I hope you brought the Windex?
Yeah, you need some. Well, Clorox wipes. People are eating on those things.
You know, it seems to have gone well for him. And he started very strategically in southeastern Iowa, a part of the state where Democrats used to dominate and have struggled in recent years. And repeatedly people said to me, you know, they don't usually come to this part of the state till later in the primary. So we give him a lot of credit for doing it, and we'll see.
Amy, there's been some attention to perhaps a double standard here, that Beto delayed making an announcement. He had this sort of soul-searching played out in the press, that a female candidate of the 5 or so we have so far would have been punished for looking indecisive.
I'm
Do
sure
you
there's
buy that?
still, there is still going, and there will always be a double standard. When we look at whether they're candidates of color or women are going to be judged different standards than white men. At the same time, I do think every one of these candidates gets their little boomlet, gets their time to make their case. And this is why the debates are going to be so important, because all this is right now is sort of fluff. When they're all on the stage together, making the case that they have the best opportunity, I'm the best person here, to go up against Donald Trump, that's when voters really get to see what they're made of.
You know, he's a little bit, I would argue that Beto O'Rourke is the best natural candidate out running for this era, right? He understands social media. He's willing to engage in that sphere in a way that Donald Trump has engaged in, and nobody else really kind of can do that. What we don't know is, can he do all the other things that have to be done in a campaign? Can he build out an organization? Can he raise the money? Can he withstand all the hits that are going to come his way? Those are really big things. But you know, this week there was a kind of a little bit of an upset. A lot of women I talked to were really upset about the way he talked about his wife and raising their kids. That came up a lot. So I took it on myself to start calling around to some of the people and friends and family.
Because he said his wife mainly raises the children.
That's right. So I started calling women who don't live in Washington, who don't live in California, and asking them, Michigan, Georgia, Texas, Ohio, asking them what they thought. And the most interesting response was a 70-year-old woman relative in Detroit who said to me, oh, yeah, I saw that. I really like that.
So I think she thought he was giving his wife credit.
She thought he was giving his wife credit. So I think sometimes that things sound differently to people who live in different places, and we just have to wait and see how this all susses out.
Which is why the process is so important. You haven't heard Democrats yet, it's going to happen, say this process is too unwieldy, we're going to damage the ultimate nominee by having all of these debates and this, lasting far too long. Right now, I think it is the only way to determine which one of these candidates meets all of those different criteria that Jamal pointed out of who's going to be able to raise the money, look like they can stand up to the president, be able to be inspiring, also have a pathway to the White House that looks to voters like a realistic path to the White House.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there with the three of you, but more to come when we come back from this break with some analysis of the week that was. We turn now to our panel for some analysis on the other big news of the week. Jamal Simmons and Amy Walter are joined by Ramesh Ponnoru, who is a senior editor at National Review and a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, and Mark Landler covers the White House and foreign policy for the New York Times. Good to have you join us. Ramesh, let me ask you, Amy brought up in the last segment this point about it not just being about the 2020 presidential race, it's also about some of these congressional seats. Senators, some of them we saw with this vote on the rebuke to the president, the accusation that maybe they were a little worried about their seats in 2020, and that may have swayed some Republicans to stick with the president instead of rebuking him. How big of a concern and a factor was that?
Well, I think it's very striking that of the 12 Republican senators who did not vote with the president, who voted to disapprove his declaration of a national emergency, only one of them is running in 2020. There was a risk on both sides, right? There's the general election risk because the emergency is unpopular and the wall is unpopular. But among Republicans, these things are very popular. And obviously, I think a lot of Republicans showed that they were more concerned about winning their primaries than they were about the general election.
Who do you have in mind? Is it Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who took a lot of heat for that 11th hour switch of his vote?
Tom Tillis in North Carolina, Cory Gardner in Colorado, Joni Ernst in Iowa. All of them voted with the president. and not with, the 12 Republicans like Mitt Romney and Pat Toomey, Mike Lee, and others who had these constitutional concerns about what the president's doing.
Mark, Mick Mulvaney was on this program and said that he thinks the White House, has nothing to worry about with this attempt to override the veto. But how was this received inside the White House? It was the president's first time to use the pen in this way.
And it was also the first time the president was rebuffed this way by Republicans. Ramesh points out that several of them didn't go the whole way. But the fact of the matter is, after 2 years in which the Republicans have been just an absolute reliable sort of bastion for the president in Congress, I thought this was still symbolically important. And I'm sure that President Trump's argument is, well, I didn't pitch as hard as I could have. If I'd really asked for the votes, I would have gotten them. But nevertheless, they must be looking at this and thinking, do we have Mitch McConnell as reliably as we thought we did? And facing the prospect of more unpopular, potentially policy decisions and debates down the road, is this the first in what will be a more independent Republican majority in the Senate, a majority that's going to make decisions not just blindly following the White House and President Trump?
Some might say that's wishful thinking.
Yeah.
Indeed. And I stipulate that we haven't seen it, and we've had the same sort of discussion many, many times in the past. Well, this will be the moment that they show their independence, and they continue not to do that. Having said that, this was a somewhat different set of circumstances. It didn't play out quite as well as I think the White House hoped it would, and so that's got to be at least somewhat concerning for them.
Do you think this resonates with people at home, or is it lost on them?
I do think it doesn't really resonate unless the president wants it to resonate, in which case what he does very well is turns it back against Congress. I think he loves the idea that, look, I told you people in Washington didn't understand us and our vision for how we keep America safe. They're trapped in their old ways of thinking. I'm here to break us out of this. And so it actually works for him, even when it's members of his own party. I think this is very beneficial to him. And I do agree that with the question of whether this signals more dissension or whether it's just this was a really easy vote. The veto, they're never going to have to vote on this again. They're not going to have, it's going to die in the House, most likely. They won't have to vote on this again. And then it's in the courts, where ultimately means that none of the discussion that we're having right now may ever have to turn into reality.
Ramesh, one of the few areas where we did see some public criticism of the president from Republicans was on the foreign policy front. Again, going into 2020, I guess there are some questions about, well, what does the president say he delivered on when it comes to North Korea? What does he say he delivered on when the promise to pull all troops out of Afghanistan? And we have some upcoming decisions on both of those things. How much of a political lens should we be putting on them?
I tend to think that those sorts of foreign policy decisions are not all that politically significant in a presidential election unless something has gone very, very wrong. And in that case, people start holding politicians accountable and asking why things that they themselves as voters weren't paying attention to weren't done. So I think the stakes politically are low, even if the stakes for our long-term national security are kind of high. Right now, I think the president can say that to his core voters, look, I have been trying to pull out of our commitments overseas, or at least downsize them in an intelligent way, and I think that that is going to be accepted as fine. I don't think that there are a ton of Republican voters who are saying to themselves, we need to be more involved in Syria. We need to be more involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I think that he's going to be fine on this front.
Mark, we had the president go to the Pentagon on Friday for a classified briefing. Do we know what threats he was actually getting briefed on?
Well, we don't precisely know what threats he was getting briefed on. The assumption is clear he was probably being briefed on North Korea. He was probably being briefed on Syria, where, after all, he made this decision to leave some American troops behind after saying he was going to withdraw them, and probably also on Afghanistan. We are in the midst of this peace reconciliation process with the Taliban, and part of that process is setting a definite timeline for withdrawing the remaining troops there. So I'm sure some combination of those issues, plus Iran, were probably all on the table at that point.
And there are about 12,000 troops still in Afghanistan.
That's right. And that conversation has become very complicated in the last couple of weeks because the Afghan government feels that we, the United States, has cut them out of the process. We're dealing directly with the Taliban. The Afghans don't have a seat at the table, and that's become very contentious just in the last week in Washington, with a couple visiting Afghan officials raising some very serious criticisms of the administration.
Do you hear anything from this week with what's being described as sort of a blow symbolically to the president, or the frustrations in trying to deliver on some of these foreign policy promises? Is there any rich territory for Democrats to message and mine?
I mean, I think in the Democratic political establishment, or the Democratic left, the voters, people are thinking more about Russia and Russian influence than they are about some of the more fine points of foreign policy. They generally get the president is not really doing very well, and the Democratic candidates don't seem to be that far apart on this. I think what people on the Democratic side are trying to do is offer an alternate vision about what's important. So the reason the president and immigration focus is important is for his base is because it says to particularly white, disaffected voters, I'm the guy who's standing up against the brown people coming into the United States and trying to preserve the country for you. I think what the Democrats are trying to say is there's actually a bigger problem that happens. And so if you look at what happened with the cheating scandal with the schools, like there's this sort of mob of people who are at the top. They've got all the goodies. So this goodies mob, and I'm not talking about CeeLo, but there's like a goodies mob out there, right, that is dividing up all the opportunity among each other. And those are the people that we all have to be worried about. How do we tilt the scales back in favor of working people? And somebody like Elizabeth Warren, who talked about this idea of breaking up big tech companies, is somebody who's driving this agenda on the left that says maybe we've got to change the rules about how we deal with our economy. And that's an alternate vision that I think Democrats are trying to establish.
And yet that's also going back to the who's the safe choice. And for Democrats, trying to balance these two very important segments of their electorate, the ones who do see that the system is rigged, they're attracted to the Bernie Sanders message, also who's going to turn out that Obama coalition that Hillary did not, younger voters, voters of color. But the newest coalition are those white suburban voters who came out, and guess who they voted for? They voted for Beto. That's how Beto came so close in Texas. It wasn't the rise of younger or Latino voters, it was white suburban voters who came out and voted for Democrats in the House and for Beto. How do you keep those voters from either staying home or defecting back to Donald Trump? If you put a candidate, it goes the theory, someone like Elizabeth Warren, someone like Bernie Sanders, that's going to turn off those voters who were willing to vote for us, say Democrats in 2018.
But Jamal, Bernie Sanders is trying to woo black voters right now in South Carolina. He's trying to make up a difference, I guess.
He's trying. Well, there's a funny picture that was going around the internet yesterday of him at an African-American church in South Carolina, but everybody in the room was white. Right, and so what happened was they built a crowd, but it wasn't actually the crowd of the membership of that particular church. So he's got a little bit of a tougher road. I think of the two of them, Elizabeth Warren probably is the one people may buy into a little bit more. But here's my real guess: is that somebody, whoever the Democratic nominee is, will end up adopting a lot of the policy choices that Bernie and Elizabeth Warren put forward, because that seems to be where the passion of the left is.
We will see. Thanks to all of you. We will be back in a moment with a look at a unique new class of congressional interns. Politics and football meet head-on this spring with an unusual class of interns on Capitol Hill. CBS News special correspondent James Brown reports.
Michael Thomas,
great to see you.
Austin Carr, and Ryan Hunter are used to running, blocking, or catching for a living. But for the last couple of weeks, they have been running around the halls of Congress, tackling the big issues facing the country.
I've been fortunate to sit in on meetings with foreign policy administrators from the Middle East, whether it be constituents from the state of Missouri and the city of Kansas City, St. Louis.
Ryan Hunter is an offensive lineman for the Kansas City Chiefs. He's interning for freshman Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri.
This is fun because we're both new together. So Ryan's new, I'm new, we're kind of learning the ropes together. I think it's phenomenal that NFL players and like Ryan, who are very busy guys and have a career that they're pursuing, want to be involved in their communities, want to be involved in service.
Michael Thomas plays safety for the New York Giants. This is his second time working for Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who represents his district in Houston, Texas.
What a better place to be, not necessarily only in my office, but in many offices where they can be change agents and translate that leadership on the field into making a difference.
After interning last year, I was like, I gotta come back because I saw firsthand what she's doing and how much she's really on the ground, like putting in the work. A lot of things that we were fighting for criminal justice reform, bail reform, education, reentry with juvenile detentions and stuff like that. She's already had bills written. They're on the floor. She's proposing these things. So I'm like, okay, this is how we can take that next step.
And you are firmly convinced that Capitol Hill, this arena, this venue, if you will, can effect the kind of meaningful changes that you and others who have the same feeling
Absolutely.
can bring about.
Absolutely. I mean, it's gonna take, it's gonna take time. Nothing happens overnight. I can see how other people can say, man, like, that's slow. We need something now. We need to do something now. And I get that passion. I feel it.
Austin Carr is a wide receiver for the New Orleans Saints. He is pro-life and interested in some libertarian ideas, which is why he is interning for Kentucky Senator Rand Paul.
I'm seeing how hard they work, in particular Senator Rand Paul, how often he's running to and fro to different meetings, different committees, meeting with constituents.
What have you seen in this young man, Senator?
We're glad to have him here, and I think it's good to see another side of our athletes.
According to the NFLPA, the average NFL career lasts just under 4 years. In 2014, the union started an externship program to prepare players for life after the NFL. Since then, 183 players have had on-the-job training in a variety of fields. Michael Thomas is a member of the union's executive board, and he sees this as an opportunity to speak for his community. Thomas was one of the players who protested police brutality by kneeling during the national anthem.
Me being here, being in the inside interning, I see the steps that need to be taken. I'm willing to put in the work. I'm willing to advocate for it. I'm willing to help out Congresswoman Jackson Lee any way I can, using my voice and my platform, same way I did it on the football field and taking a knee.
Austin Carr met with the Attorney General of Louisiana to talk about the opioid crisis.
Nationwide, the U.S. consumes 80% of opioids in the world, right?
Ryan Hunter learned more about brain injuries after meeting with the Society for Neuroscience.
I'd rather be here than be in the Bahamas because I'm learning so much for the future that this experience in its own beats, having an umbrella drink on the beach.
These pro athletes came to Washington to learn from political leaders, but their mentors seem to learn from them as well.
No, I'm glad to see that Austin, believes strongly in his faith, and that it sounds like he wants to be part of trying to make things better in the country, but also be an example for kids out there that look up to our stars.
Having players say, I want to be involved, I want to serve, I want to see it from the inside, I want to do something about that. That's awesome. We need more of that. And I think Ryan's a great example.
I hope he will be able to be here when we are seeing these bills pass out of the House and the Senate, where we have changed the criminal justice system. Wouldn't that be great? That's my heart and passion, and I hope he will be part of it.
Absolutely.
And we'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.